Good morning, everyone. So welcome to the third day of the EMANES annual conference. We have been having very rich days yesterday and Wednesday, and we will continue on this pace. This morning, we are very happy to have with us Dr. Eckhard Ernest, who is the Chief of Macroeconomic Policies and Job Unit at the ILO, International Labour Organization. He's also an EMEA member of the advisory board. We are very happy to have you with us, Eckhard. And you will present the challenges and opportunities in the labor markets in Europe and Mediterranean and Africa. So the floor is yours, Eckhard. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for having me. Let me just open my presentation and then we can go. 1 second. Sorry, this is probably not the right one. Do you see the full screen version or the other one? I don't, because I'm on
we see the two screens.
Okay, so that is not what I wanted to show. Sorry about that. Oh, just somehow I don't seem to be able to do this properly. Now you should see the excellent. Sorry about that. Yeah, so thank you very much for having me. Eckhard Ernst from the International Labour Organization and the research department. And I have decided to slightly change a bit the focus of the presentation this morning, simply because I wanted to give you a bit of an advanced taste of our annual publication that comes out in January, in I think it's less than 3 weeks from now, where we focus very much on a pressing topic in a lot of countries in Europe, including in the transition economies in Eastern Europe and in Central Asia, which is labor market shortages. And I will explain to you a bit how I see this kind of a topic fit into a wider range of issues. As you're certainly aware of, we have obviously this, what some people call the polycrisis of interconnected challenges between automation, acceleration of technological change, demographic shifts that are happening in a lot of countries, including in some emerging economies in North Africa and in the Middle East. And then obviously climate change. I mean, Rim and myself, we just came back from COP28, where this was obviously the topic to be addressed, and the related issues about geopolitical tensions that we are all very much aware of. And so somehow in between these kind of interconnected challenges, labor market shortages or labor shortages play a significant role in kind of preventing us to a certain extent from addressing these interconnected challenges properly. And the question will be, and I will address this towards the end of my presentation, what kind of policies specifically focused on the labor market, obviously, what kind of policies can we put in place in order to address these challenges. Now, what was kind of just as a context, maybe what is really surprising is after the pandemic, we kind of quickly shifted gears from a fear of a total breakdown of our economies towards a fear of we actually don't find enough workers to deliver on the recovery. Yeah? So early 2020, complete stop of a large part of economic activities. Everybody was confined to stay at home. to the extent possible. And within a few, I mean, I'm tempted to say even a few months, this kind of sentiment shifted. And we are now seeing that instead of experience mass unemployment due to technological change and COVID, we actually see mass under lack of workers, and so there's this strong sense of a labor market resilience despite economic slowdown. I mean, especially in the part of Europe where I'm sitting in Western Europe, economic performance has been extremely poor over the last a year and a half or so. Switzerland is actually quite okay still, but if you think about Germany, is in a technical recession, and yet the labor market is very strong, and that's something which we haven't really experienced so much in the past. And the question really is, what type of mechanism is behind these labor shortages? And we will see in a minute that actually all three of the mechanisms that I'm mentioning here are to a certain extent at play. There's obviously a strong surge in labor demand from fiscal policies, from an extremely accommodative monetary policy, at least until early last year. There is some catch-up consumption. People have obviously been, because of the confinement, build up a lot of saving that are being drawing down from. So that's one element to it. But there are other elements in terms of the shift in terms of labor force participation, and especially in terms of hours worked. And we'll see a bit more later on exactly what that entails. And then the last part, which is the traditional part for labor market imbalances, is really the skill and geographical mismatch, something that has been extremely prominent in Europe, at least in the 1980s, and seems to make a return. It's obviously not only true for advanced economies. There's in a lot of emerging markets, there's a similar problem, and I'll show you a bit in a later slide. The extent to which these mismatches actually preventing countries from performing much better. Now, the question obviously is on something that comes up in the discussion that we had also internally, is like, why do you talk about labor shortages if they are really so specific to certain regions? And clearly in a lot of sub-Saharan African countries, Latin America, also in some South Asian countries, it's more like the lack of jobs rather than lack of workers. But what the argument that we kind of put forward is really that to the extent that there is a interconnected global economy, these type of shortages in advanced economies, where at the end of the day firms produce below potential, will have global spillovers. There's labor supply disruption that will affect global supply chains. We have seen that also during the crisis, during the pandemic, and it continues to affect our economies. And sometimes, at the beginning, it was more like disruptions in China would affect activity in Europe. Now it seems to be the other way around. It's the fact that we actually will be producing below potential, if does have a spillover effect also to emerging economies, including on the other side of the planet. And obviously you see price effects in terms of energy and food prices as an enormous problem in a lot of emerging economies, much more actually than it is in Europe. I mean, energy prices is a problem in Europe, but food prices are not being felt so much, for the simple reason that food items are not a big part of the consumption baskets of the average European consumer. And so these bottlenecks have ripple effects throughout the economy, both in terms of country interlinkages, but also in terms of sectoral linkages. Especially when you think about it, essential workers are missing in health and transportation, logistics, etc., which will have consequences to consumers at the end of the consumption chain. So, for instance, I mean, for those of you who have been traveling the last few months or so, you know that airport air travel has become extremely painful, simply because there are not only pilots missing, but also ground staff missing in terms of baggage handling, etc. And so, as long as this is not being solved, this will have ripple effects throughout the economy. And we will have a look at it a bit more closely in terms of what this means. But just kind of the big picture here, and which is really, as I said, extremely surprising, effect of the aftermath of the pandemic is this extreme increase in job vacancies that you will see here on the right side in comparison to what we saw over the 2010s. You see that prior to the global financial crisis, you had this build-up in vacancies already. Then you, for a long time, for around 10 years or so, a relatively stable performance on the labor market, and yet, I mean, employment growth was actually quite strong over the 2010s. And then as we recovered from the pandemic, all of a sudden there's another spike, and that spike hasn't really resided. This is really the publication that we will publish in January, so it goes up to May 23. That's the latest data we have for vacancies. But you see that despite the fact that there was a significant slowdown in terms of economic activity, vacancy still remains significantly above the last 10 years. And so that is obviously something which requires a bit of explanation. Why do we see these shortages in terms of workers not or firms not being able to hire according to their demand? And now, the first point to mention is that these kind of vacancies are actually very specific to particular sectors, and that kind of brings us also already to the first element in terms of the sectoral mismatch, if you want, or the asymmetric dimension of the shortage. So you see that here across countries, it's almost always the same type of sectors that are missing workers, mostly in healthcare. Some shortages also in ICT and manufacturing. Construction is also an issue. I live in a neighborhood where there is actually a new building currently being constructed, and that building the construction should have started a year ago. Simply, they didn't have enough workers to start the building. And so that has a clear indication that it's not across the board type of shortage. It's really specific to certain sectors, and interestingly, it's the same sectors everywhere across at least OECD countries, but also from discussions that I had with colleagues in transition economies in Eastern Europe, etc. This seems to be a similar problem there. Now, obviously, the question is, has it something to do with the people not coming back to work? And so we looked specifically in certain categories. So you actually, when you look at the headline indicators for labor force participation, they are back to where they were before the crisis. So that doesn't seem to be the case. But obviously, kind of there is a group-specific dimension to it, and the two groups that are typically hard hit by crisis are women and young people. Now, if you look at the female participation rate, and here we compare the actual numbers in 2023 with the trend that we would have expected from the evolution over the last 15 years. And so the linear trend that we kind of projected here is the one in blue, and which we would have expected for 2023, and the orange one is or the yellow one is the one that we actually observe. And you see that the cross-country differences significantly. Some countries or some regions like Northern Africa or Latin America have significantly underperformed in comparison to their trends. Other regions seem to be the opposite. Interestingly, Arab states from a very low level, admittedly, have performed much better than what you would have expected from the linear trend. And so which is also true for Central and Western Asia, which is essentially Iran and some countries in like Kazakhstan, etc. But most of the countries are actually on track. Also, most of the regions, there's very little variation in terms of what you would have expected. So for women, it doesn't seem to be a particular issue here that they seem to have underperformed. What is more problematic is young people. And what is interestingly here is traditionally you would expect young people to work actually less, simply because they are typically hard hit by crisis. But again, it doesn't seem to be the case. On the contrary, you see most regions actually young people have performed much better than they would have what you would have expected, just judging from the historical trend. So youth participation actually exceeds the linear prediction, especially in in upper middle and in high income countries. So that is actually a surprising result, especially if you think about what happened in the after the global financial crisis, where young people really were the ones that had hard hit. If you think about unemployment rates in countries like Spain, Italy, or Greece, where you had youth unemployment rates of 50 or 45 to 50%, which was kind of significantly. But that doesn't seem to be a case in this particular situation after the pandemic. What does concern us still is what we consider or what we call youth not in employment, education, or training, the famous need rate, which is essentially saying that these young people, they're inactive and they don't use their inactivity to actually improve their training. So if, I don't know, going to school or going to a vocational training center, etc. And here you see cross-country or cross-regional differences are very significant here. Some regions have over 30% where the young people essentially are inactive, and that's obviously terrible because this is not related to I don't know, disability, etc. And like for older people, you can have that situation sometimes that people drop out of the labor force simply because they have health problems, etc. For young people, that typically doesn't seem to be the case. And if you look at some of these countries, South Asia or Arab states, North Africa as well, to a certain extent, these young people that essentially don't pick up anything, any new skills, and are waiting to in the hope that somehow things will improve. Again, here a significant gender dimension to it. You see that women typically have much higher need rates than men. And that obviously precludes these young women even more than their fellow young men from entering successfully the labor market. I mean, typically there's kind of a rule of thumb, if you want, like any 6 months of unemployment or inactivity for young people will be felt in terms of lower employment and employment chances and wage growth for the next 10 to 15 years. So these are significant concerns that these young people will have enormous problems to successfully enter the labor market over the next decade or so. Now the question obviously then still is, so if it's not women, if it's not young people that are as problematic in terms of, or that are the underlying these labor shortages, the question is there something else going on? So one thing that we still struggle with, and these numbers are unfortunately from 2022, so we don't really know what happened this year, is sickness is still a concern. For those of you, I don't know about Spain now, but in Switzerland as well, the COVID cases have gone up again. And so there's a significant concern that as the pandemic becomes endemic, the health consequences of repeated COVID infections will be felt in the form of higher sickness days. You see here that between 2019 and 2022, in almost all countries that we have data for, there was a significant increase in sick days per worker and year, and that is not likely to go back to pre-pandemic levels. Now, I'm sorry. Now the question is obviously to what extent that kind of reflects these labor shortages. Here, this is a study for the UK where they have tried to kind of disentangle this a bit more. The different types of rise of inactivity, and you see that here this is in total numbers there. There's 500,000 people more inactive than what you would have expected at the beginning of the pandemic. And to a large extent, this has something to do with long-term sickness issues. There are, and this is interesting here in relation to what I mentioned earlier, in the UK at least, there are also some young people did take up more studies. So clearly there is an effect in that sense as well. But to a large extent, the long-term health issues of COVID seem to continue affect our economies. Now, a big part, and that's I think where we kind of want to emphasize, where we put our emphasis in our analysis, is a big part of what happened found in the during the pandemic is not so much the number of people in employment or in the labor force, but rather the number of hours they work per worker. So you can see that the total hours worked both in the world as a whole and for high income countries has actually recovered above or close to the pre-pandemic level. But what has not recovered is hours per worker. So there is actually a significant increase in part-time work and overall in the reduced intensity of labor force utilization. You can maybe more clearly see this if you specifically hone in on terms of what happened in advanced economies here, the difference between North America and Europe. There's a significant difference in terms of total hours worked in comparison to average hours worked. So in a sense, what it actually says is that people return to work, but they don't work individually. They don't work as much as before, which is obviously a problem. Again, there is a sectoral dimension to it, which is maybe not surprising, but important to note. Here, the average hours worked has decreased, especially in certain in those sectors that I mentioned before, where the shortages were particularly severe. But not only, as you see also here, you see, for instance, other sectors like restaurants, etc., that have significant declines in terms of average hours worked. So there seems to be an issue here that certain sectors have a problem to attract workers to work actually as much as they used to work, and so that again contributes to this kind of sectoral dimension or sectoral mismatch in terms of labor shortages that I mentioned at the beginning. Kind of looking maybe kind of switching gears a bit and looking at the global picture here. The skills shortages that I mentioned, or the labor shortages that are relevant in high income countries, are really a high kind of skills shortages here. So you see, this is a statistics that was done before the pandemic, but it gives you a kind of an overview of kind of where the challenges are. And actually, in most as you go down the development level, you see that countries at upper middle, lower middle, and low income countries have a particular challenge in terms of a workforce that is undereducated with respect to the requirements of employers. So you see that here these people actually would need much higher skills. So it's a true skill shortage. But in terms of projection, actually, you see that the most of the skill shortages are actually in advanced economy. So this is until 2025, and the skills gap here is simply the amount of skilled labor that's available in comparison to that will be demanded over the next few years. And you see that internationally there is a significant mismatch. So it's not only a sectoral mismatch, but it's also a geographical mismatch across countries between those countries who actually have the manpower, but don't have necessarily the skills to export, if you want, their labor, and those countries who would need a skilled labor. And you see that North Africa and the Middle East, to a certain extent, is in the middle of these gaps. So they have actually a certain skill gap, but so they would in principle be attractive for more skilled workers. But as you all know, these countries often export their labor, their skilled labor at least, also to advanced economies. Now, the one question obviously you always get is like, when you have these type of talent and labor shortages, is why don't we see more productivity growth? I mean, in principle, all these problems could be solved if we have productivity growth that would replace the labor that we need by machines. Now, unfortunately, despite the fact that we see all these technological advancements, and here this is a chart that unfortunately now is a bit dated already, about on the right side on patenting activity in AI, you see that there was a significant acceleration, and obviously we all know how important it still is in our current discussions, the importance of AI, and yet, despite this seeming acceleration in technological development, at the aggregate level in terms of productivity growth, we don't see much happening here. This is from the conference board data where you see that prior to the pandemic, there was already a slowdown in terms of productivity growth, both in advanced and in emerging markets. There was a bit of a cyclical effect from the pandemic, compositional effect, where one would have hoped that this high productivity growth that's in 2021 would carry over, but unfortunately that doesn't seem to be the case. And last year we published in our report long-term trends of productivity growth, where you compare this also over the, let's say, over the last 50 years. And you see that for advanced economies, there was a gradual decline, which continues up to today. I mean, even a well-performing economy like the US has enormous difficulties to accelerate its productivity growth. And what is more concerning is that that kind of slowdown in productivity growth also seems to be a problem for emerging economies. You see here for China now, it has declined, obviously at a very high level, but still there is a decline of 4 percentage points or so over the last 5 years. Similarly for India, and then Brazil has, I mean, Latin America overall has an enormous problem in terms of productivity growth. And in Brazil, we are seeing negative numbers now again over the last few years. And obviously the flip side onto the slow productivity growth is that wage growth is also low. And so this is a publication from our colleagues on the global wage report that came out last year. And you see that when you take out China in particular, or you just look at the advanced economies, wage growth has been extremely low, negative in 2022, even negative now. We see some of the numbers that we published in our report will show you a negative numbers again for 2023. So a significant drop in take-home pay and disposable income. Including in some G20 emerging countries. So there's a significant loss in well-being, if you want, and obviously that has repercussions on the political level, as we can all see right now. And so the problem really is that if productivity growth is not high, and wage growth is obviously not high either, that partly might explain why we see these labor shortages not being adjusted. So as wages are sticky in the short run, so this surge in vacancies that I showed at the beginning really did not prove any meaningful wage growth, partly because of the fact that companies will just not be able to pay higher wages to begin with. And I mean, maybe just going back to this chart again, one thing that is really important to notice that these aggregate productivity numbers hide a significant variation and an increasing variation. So you have some companies that are extremely well performing, like especially in the tech industry. A colleague of mine from Burning Glass has published just yesterday a chart which really shows how much additional value added was created by tech companies in comparison to the rest of the economy, even though these tech companies are contributing only very little to overall employment. So you see this long tail of companies that are actually performing very well, and you see the mass of the companies who have even less productivity growth than what is hiding behind these numbers. So the average really is hiding this extreme heterogeneity, which means at the end, which is kind of the argument that we are trying to make here, is that most companies, even if they want to, cannot pay higher wages to attract worker, or cannot improve their working condition to attract workers. So there is a significant challenge here for labor markets to adjust, simply because the traditional, let's say, textbook mechanism of wage adjustment with respect to labor shortages just does not work in such an environment. And then you obviously have the additional fact that as you have these cost shocks from energy and food prices that I mentioned at the beginning, you have a significant erosion because there is simply no way of bargaining higher wages to accommodate this. The same goes for working conditions. The same logic is, if you want, applies. So we have these partly the sectoral problems that we see has something to do with the fact that a lot of these sector shortages are concentrated in those sectors who actually, in comparison to others, have even lower labor productivity and labor productivity growth, and cannot neither pay higher wages nor improve their working conditions. And essentially, basically, that means that these people these sectors, these companies that that operate in sectors fail to attract a sufficient amount of workers. We also mentioned in the report, and that's just as a side note here, that obviously there are also geographical barriers to mobility, as we have seen rising house costs, partly because of the housing boom in the last 10, 15 years. People have enormous difficulties to move around. Small countries like Switzerland can be solved by longer commuting times, but in many other countries, including in many other European countries, it's actually simply not possible because the distances are too far, and people have really difficulties changing their location. And the last point, that brings me already to the let's say to the structural phenomena behind some of these shortages, has obviously to do with the fact that, especially in advanced economies, but not only, people are getting older, and when they're getting older, you see that people are moving around much less. So here you see the share of the labor force aged 55 and older from this year in comparison to 20 years ago. And you see that it's a significant increase. I mean, Italy is kind of clearly an outlier here, but even in other countries, and even in countries who have a relatively healthy, if I may say so, population growth like Israel, you still see the increase in the share of older workers that it will eventually have, and this is here the related note to it, it will eventually have an implication for job-to-job transition rates. As people get older, they tend to switch jobs less often, and switching jobs is all reduced labor mobility across job mobility means also that some of these shortages simply will not be addressed in a reasonable amount of time. So I mentioned already the slow productivity growth as one part of this resource misallocation, as part of these problems, and I wanted to emphasize again that I think one of the elements that is a bit overlooked, and I'm trying to kind of push my own organization into that kind of consideration. I think we really need to focus our policy action much more on increasing productivity growth rather than kind of trying to bring workers back into the labor force, because the labor force is not really the issue. The big issue is really kind of getting productivity off the ground. And I think that there are significant policy challenges that have something to do with the fact that we in the past, let's say 10, 15 years, made some policy choices that did not really kind of promote stronger productivity growth. The one typical issue that is being being put forward, it has something to do with the fact that these extremely accommodative monetary policy lifted a bit the constraints on unproductive firms. So the issue of zombie firms is actually not something which is it's something that is empirically relevant. So it's not something to be discarded easily. But that's not the only element. The other element is that a lot of fiscal policy measures have been untargeted. They have not been targeted towards improved infrastructure development, and that's including in very rich countries like Switzerland. I mean, we're seeing a significant constraint in terms of infrastructure, simply because fiscal policies have not been sufficiently targeted. And then one important point to mention here is public R&D. So public support for innovation policies is something that has kind of declined significantly over the last 20 years, and that is clearly not helping in terms of productivity growth. So here the important element to take from this argument is to say that even the technological progress is maybe there, but it doesn't translate into significant take-up from across the board from companies, which is why we see this kind of large spread in terms of productivity growth across the company demographics, if you want. So you have these few companies that are highly innovative, but the rest of the the rest of the business sector is not capable of picking up these technological changes. And partly that has to do with the fact that fiscal policies are not sufficiently supportive in that capacity to take up these innovations. And this, I think one of the biggest concerns we have is this type of evolution that we're seeing over the last 3 to 5 years is that as we're leaving the pandemic behind, a lot of these shortages might become endemic. So we obviously already see population aging. And again, it's not something which is only relevant in Europe. We're seeing this that China is the fastest aging country in the world. We see this in other emerging countries, even including in some Latin American countries that start to age as well. And so over time, that obviously means that by 2030, so we see a larger and larger share of countries facing shrinking working age populations, facing lower enrollment rates in higher education, which obviously also reduces growth prospects, and facing changing consumption patterns, again, with the relevant skills need. And I think that's something that's important to note or it's important to address by policymakers as we're going forward. Related to that, we do have global imbalances. So we obviously still have a growing population in the global south. So that is something that can in principle be used as an advantage, and if it's properly being accompanied with policies, and we can talk about this maybe in the Q&A as well. And then the last point, as I mentioned, green transition already. I think that the technological and the digital and green transition that we are facing now as countries will require new skills in different sectors, and so that skills mismatch part that I mentioned before will actually become a more and more important in comparison to, let's say, a general labor shortage that we experience. So I wanted to conclude with a few policies for labor market resilience. Just to kind of give you a sense of where our own thinking is going, and I think that I mentioned already some of the elements. I think that the 3 points that are really key for us in this respect is these 3 highlighted in blue: is identify the relevant skills, support the transition, and then maybe more globally manage migration between those countries who have labor shortages and those countries who have a capacity or potential for exporting educated, if you want, people. Now, I mean, the identification of relevant skills, I think that we don't necessarily need to go into much detail here. This is something that a lot of institutions are focusing on, to develop skills anticipation of our scenarios, to develop early warning systems, etc. Also, some countries like Singapore have developed a whole framework of transition, so that it essentially kind of combines 1 and 2 here. So identify the skills and support the transition, in a sense that you not only want to kind of help people to identify what the next step is, but you want to also give them a relevant education to, for instance, to certification or competence development policies that will help them to make this transition. So it's not only important to say where are the skills, where are the new jobs, but it's also important to accompany those who are actually willing to change occupations, sectors, etc. And at the global level, obviously that includes collaboration across countries. So I mentioned here the Canada as one example. There are pilot projects in Belgium and in Germany, for instance, on global skills partnerships in specific sectors where local staff is being trained according to Belgian or German standards, and then being offered opportunities to move. For the moment, as I said, these are pilot projects, so we don't have a good sense of how strong or how well this system will function in the future. But there's something that to keep in mind. And then maybe a last point. I skipped this one. I wanted to kind of focus on this last point, especially on the right side here, is I think as we move towards a more and more competence-based framework, we have to go beyond that idea that only certified skills that we get out of the school system are the ones that can be remunerated. McKinsey has done a study, and this is the chart on the right here, where they actually estimate the extent to which your wage is determined by your experience in comparison to your formal skills. And as you can see, so the formal skills part is this dark blue or black bar underneath, and then the earnings associated with work experience is the light blue one. And as you become older, as you have more experience, etc., naturally that kind of part will become more and more important. But it also means that it will be harder for you as an individual to move jobs and to get to command the same type of salary that is based on your experience rather than on your formal skills. And so there are experiments now, and Boston Consulting Group actually came out with a study earlier this week where they kind of showed that increasingly companies will start using a competence-based framework rather than a purely skills-based framework as a way of attracting workers that have a certain amount of experience, but cannot show formally that they have these relevant competencies. And so there are frameworks, there are possibilities to do that. And I think this is the kind of way forward where we kind of be beyond, let's say, skills anticipation and managed migration. We also want to make sure that we offer a new institutional framework where your experience that will grow as the workforce will get older. It can be used in different occupations, different sectors, and still offer you the same type of salary that you have had in your previous occupation. So with that, I thank you very much. I have shown you here some publications that are relevant maybe for you. We can have a look at it also on some of the other work that we're doing on future of work. And I do think we have a few minutes left if you want for some Q&A. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good morning, first of all, Eckhard.
Morning.
Thank you for this fascinating presentation, which in fact raises a lot of questions. I have a couple of questions to start the discussion. One is there is a lot of work now on the involvement of social production in the prosperity measures at national levels. Of course, all these unpaid, informal, and socially productive activities are completely excluded from national prosperity measures. And I think this could also be looked at when you are talking about moving into, unofficial type of competence matrix, which are not really within the skills or official skills assessment or definitions that you have on the basis of which you are assessing the shortages and the talent shortages as well. So most probably we are in a way facing the limits of growth, which has been yet already mentioned several years ago, I think at least a couple of decades. And then this is only the evidence that of course, with a pandemic shock, it has become apparent that we are really moving into this limits of growth, and the evidence is in the labor market now. So of course, with aging population, we can see clearly that we need to change the model. I mean, the model is not allowing us to even fit in demand and supply in the labor market, and there are shortages. I'm not sure if we can call this resilience of our labor market, and I'm not even sure that just reviewing the skills and then support the transitions, of course, supporting the transitions, but to where? This is my question to you. So from a growth model, which has shown his limit, to another growth model, in my view, which should be taking into account the well-being of the population and the flourishing of the population. So I assume that the lack of works, especially from the youth. Probably this is voluntary. I don't know. I think it would be interesting to see whether this is voluntary or non-voluntary. And then you mentioned migration. I have my doubts on this because we are moving into a completely fragmented environment where the barriers between countries are increasing, protectionism is increasing, nationalism is increasing. So what type of migration we're talking about here, and who is going to pay for example, the safety nets. I mean, again, you mentioned that there is a kind of explanation of all these dimensional dynamics based on the fiscal policy, which has been very lax over the years. So, but not only fiscal policy, and my last question is about the interaction with the monetary policy. I mean, we also had a very lax monetary policy, which has, in a way, produced very high inflation. And now we are moving into another type of monetary policy, which is increasing the interest rates, so making even further pressure on the households to pay more. So I think there is a kind of a difficulty here on where we're going. And my last point is about, in your assessment, the role of entrepreneurship. So how do you see risk-taking in the economy to be revisited completely to allow us to move to a complete different model, which is taking us away from a worker thought to a contributor thought to the economy for well-being and for flourishing overall? So these are my questions, and I don't know if I have other questions from the floor. Najat?
Thank you very much, Rim, and thank you for this very great presentation. As you said, labor market is changing, so we have this very big demographic trend about aging, as you said in your presentation, in many OECD countries, but we are also we observe also this kind of situation in some North African countries, so it's also in some developing countries. And yeah, you said that due to the digital transformation accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic have pushed for new way of organizing work, new form of work. But we know also that this new, I'm not sure if it's really a new form of work, but we see today, maybe more than before the COVID-19, more workers in this, what we call platform economy. And this platform economy, but not only this platform economy, we have different example about kind of work that push many worker into a precarious condition, okay? Precarious condition. And so you said that we have less mobility, and so my point is we still have, and I guess maybe we will have more informal job, informal work in developed and in developing countries. Maybe due to this digital transformation, I don't know, but what we see is social protection, the model that we have today in almost all the country, is not, it's not adapted to this new form of job, is not adapted to this digital transformation that lead this new kind of work. So I think maybe we have to think about a new model about social protection, but because my point is when we protect people, when we protect workers, this will have an impact on their quality of life, their quality of work, and this will push them to change their job. You said that we have this trap, and maybe a way to avoid this trap is to have a new kind of social protection model, not only about assistance, but also insurance model.
Thank you, Najat. I don't know if there are any more questions for you. We have 2 more questions. Can you do it? Because I know that at 11 you have another meeting.
I already kind of told them that.
Okay, sorry, we will not keep you longer. Okay. So I have only a couple of questions, and then I give you the floor.
Okay.
Yagane?
Very quick one. So you already mentioned that there is we have this trend of within the labor market of moving from competence going for a competence framework rather than skills. And I was wondering whether do we have the same trend or at least some efforts done in the skills and education system? Do we have some success stories that, okay, to see this shift of getting our kids to learn more about competences, not just the skills? Yeah.
Philippe?
Thank you. Very shortly, can we say that young people are not very productive in terms of labor productivity because they lack experience? And can we say that elderly workers have less diplomas, but they have more experience? In other words, in terms of human capital theory, is there some optimum regarding the average age of the working population that would maintain or possibly raise labor productivity?
Yagane, I thought you had another question, probably.
Actually, it was about AI and like technological giants. As we see that there is a rise of these technological giants, and I think the gap between what is needed for other firms to reach, to be able to innovate above that is like very limited. And I'm afraid we are leading to a world that we have a few relevant actors and nobody else to compete with. Like, do you see that we are moving in that direction? And then having the technology only in few countries. So,
Ekahard, to you.
Excellent. No, thanks a lot. I mean, this is there's quite a bit of question to unpack. Maybe let me start with the easier ones, which is on some of the changes in the skills framework and the question about of the optimal age of a working workforce. So the competence-based framework that I mentioned is something that is currently just being experimented by some companies. We don't necessarily see this in the skills framework. I think that most countries right now are struggling quite a bit with catching up with the lack of the lacuna that have built up by the pandemic. I don't know if you've seen the recent PISA results. Across the board, extremely bad performances for young kids now at the age of 15 or so, simply because they struggled essentially after the pandemic to catch up again with the lost years during the pandemic years, and I don't think that the school system right now are ready to kind of move to a completely different system. So it's an important point, and I think that this is something which international organizations like the ILO also need to bring up and discuss. But for the moment, I don't see that kind of competence-based framework is moving or that we are moving towards that kind of framework. And so that obviously means that we will have to deal with the type of educational levels that we'll see entering the labor market. I think that the challenge really is that in the future we can no longer rely on the same type of gradual increase in education as you mentioned, in terms of younger people being less educated, maybe being more educated and gradually replacing older workers that are less so. And we actually will see a knock-on effect that over time, the average educational attainment of the workforce will decline again. So we somehow have reached a peak of what we could experience. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, I have to say, a bit against your theory is that the decline in productivity we observed was observed despite the fact that we had more and more educated people moving into the labor market. So somehow, the share of older workers has actually increased, and the share of older workers, educated older workers, also has increased. And yet we see a decline in productivity. So I'm not at all convinced that we can relate the productivity slowdown in any way to the skills composition. I mean, cross-country, yes, you see that as your human capital equipment in an economy goes up, your productivity level goes up, but over time that doesn't work. Somehow there was some disconnect, and the theory that we are trying to defend, and a bit towards your point, Reem, about the macro framework, is that what we have seen over the last 10, 15 years was a macro framework that actually encouraged unproductive investment, mostly in housing. I mean, construction has increased, but construction has not increased in terms of productivity. So we see actually, I mean, there was the for the US, it's really clearly evident is that the productivity level the level of productivity in construction is back to where we were in the 1950s. So we actually have unlearned how to build houses, if you want, and which is really dramatic, because construction is such a big sector. It's like 10 to 15% of employment everywhere. And so if you decrease productivity levels in this sector, they will have significant effects. But it has a lot to do with the macro framework where we actually encourage this type of unproductive investment in certain activities, residential housing, but also, as I said before, I mean, these zombie firms, so the firms that are actually in the market, even though they are unproductive, will have affected our productivity growth. And to a certain extent, I mean, the current shift in monetary policy making, I would think that yes, it has some costs clearly, but over time it might actually help us to go back to a model where we where we phase out, where we kind of penalize investment in unproductive activities. Unfortunately, on the fiscal side, we are not there. And I mean, one of the titles of a chapter that I wrote 2 years ago was to say that the states are back on the commanding heights, but completely exhausted. We see state sovereign debt levels at 100% or more. There's an increasing call for austerity. So my doubt is that that fiscal policy will be particularly growth enhancing, unfortunately. So I don't think that that's something that we have to count on. I think that we will have more chances to count on the monetary framework that helps us to push for more productive investment. But on the fiscal policy side, I doubt it. And also, because of the aging population, increasing amount of fiscal spending will go towards social measures like retirement income, etc., and healthcare, rather than to support innovative activities or university education, etc. So I have my doubts about the fiscal policy, I have to say. On the other hand, I would say, so I want to throw a bit of cold water on this idea that working conditions have declined. So globally, we actually don't see an increase in informality. On the contrary, so I mean, this is something which I personally found extremely surprising coming out of the pandemic. Both formality rates and what we call working poverty. So these are poverty measures based on the World Bank poverty estimates for people in employment. And you can see, we have some estimates that we publish regularly. You can also find them on our website. Both working poverty and informality rates have returned to pre-pandemic levels. In terms of working poverty, actually we're below pre-pandemic rates, not levels. So because the work population obviously increased, so we have more working poor totally, but as a percentage of the labor force, they are less. And so, in a sense, I found that actually personally very surprising. But the pandemic itself, in terms of the working conditions, seem to have relatively transitory effects only, especially in low and low middle income countries. The platform economy itself, I know it's something in everybody's mind. It's actually a quite small percentage only, and especially in low and low middle income countries, platform economy is in a sense one stepping stone towards a more formal employment. And I think that governments should actually use that mechanism to better reach out to those workers that are registered on the platform economy. China is trying to do things in this respect. We have done a podcast recently, if you want to listen to it, on the Chinese platform economy. So China trying to reach and trying to kind of use these platform workers, use the platforms to make sure that working conditions are being, that labor regulation is being upheld also in the platform economy. So there is a way of doing it. We also had some publication in the past on digital social security. So providing social security through the platform can be done. But you have to actively use these platforms for policy delivery. And that's something that governments don't necessarily feel comfortable with or don't think about it. And so I think it's an important element, especially in low and middle income countries where informality is so prevalent. So I don't think we need a necessarily new social protection model. I think we have all the elements that we need. I mean, if you want my colleagues from the social protection department, they can give you a list of guidelines to how to implement it. It's just, it's a lack of resources, clearly. And then maybe it's a lack of political will as well to implement some of these and using maybe innovative new ways of delivering. The last point on what you mentioned, Rim, the new growth model, and especially the idea of, let's say, how to integrate voluntary or non-market work into that framework. I totally agree with you. It's actually something that we observe if you look at the cross-country differences. You see that as countries develop, the share of voluntary work compared to market work increases. Now, the trick here is really how do you deal with that? So one idea would indeed be to find ways of remunerating this or kind of giving us some kind of social reward for this type of activities. I mean, that could be, for instance, through universal basic income or through some other forms of remuneration. Unfortunately, the tools that we currently have are too crude for that. And they often lead to encouraging inactivity, which is not something you want to do. You don't want to encourage inactivity. You want to encourage this type of activity. But I don't think that we have really found that model that will help us to implement this. UBI is one possibility. Contested obviously as well, especially because of its fiscal cost. And one thing I would caution against, and I want to conclude with that, is that so we did some estimates at back in the days. That's like so it's a long time, but I don't think that the conclusions are necessarily totally off the mark on UBI and introducing a universal basic income in the Netherlands in comparison to all the complicated social protection system that they have. It works extremely well if you do it rightly in terms of labor force participation. You bring people back into the labor market amazingly, but it has a highly regressive nature if you want to use it in a way that doesn't ruin your economy. So it can work, but it doesn't exactly work the way you intended. So if you want to have a UBI that is not only that is not regressive, then you actually destroy labor market incentives. So we really, as I said, we have found that golden egg that will kind of deliver us all the nice policy rewards that we expect. And I think that what will the next few years will bring is essentially is this kind of conversations in different forms to experiment maybe with new forms of social protection that can remunerate or can help non-market voluntary work in such a way that people are not being totally destituted by kind of accepting to do personal care activities, etc. So I want to conclude with that, and I wish you a very successful rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eckhard, and all of this discussion will follow because we have developed, as I mentioned to you, this work with other colleagues in neuroscience on brain capital, and we are trying to connect with other economists in Australia to work on the social production, how to connect with what they call mental wealth, using the social production within the, I'd say, the original matrix. Probably we can discuss this matter further since we are also trying to rethink this concept, and this might have an implication on overall what we consider labor market. Thank you very, very much for this fascinating discussion, and then we wish you a great day.
Thank you.
Now we move. Thank you, and we move straight away to the academic session 5, labor market. And I would like to give the floor to Raúl Ramos. Raúl, he's the Vice Rector